This is the Into the Paddock Podcast.
In terms of like the reactions from the fans afterwards, I would say that the overwhelming majority really, really enjoyed this race. But there are some concerns that we'll get to in a moment. But essentially what happened was, for whatever reason, the rubber on the tyres was not taking to the track. It was just marbling and going off. The tyres were being chewed to bits, but the grip wasn't being put down on the racetrack, so they just continued to get even worse and worse. Now, Goodyear, don't know why. According to them, the tyres are exactly the same construction of tyre that they brought to the Bristol race at the end of last season. Bullshit. There are people, such as Greg, such as Ryan Blaney, the reigning Cup Series champion, who don't believe that's the case and believe that the tyres are very obviously different. But until we get confirmation of that, we don't know. I'm willing to put it out there that it wasn't, but we'll see. There were explanations put forth, maybe because they put down the resin instead of the PJ1 on the lower bank area of the track, or the lower part of the track anyway. I don't see why that would have necessarily had this massive change either. But what it meant is that for at least the opening half of the race, drivers were struggling to do 40 laps on a set of tyres, which at Bristol is nothing. They had, I believe it was 9 sets of tyres at the start of the race that they were allowed to use, and then Goodyear and NASCAR allowed them an extra set because they just happened to have that many tyres available that every car could have one. And I would say, it got better as the race went on, as the teams adjusted to their cars, as the drivers worked out what they needed to do. They ended up getting more and more mileage. I think at one point the drivers were able to do like 70 laps, but still, that's not much.
Yeah.
So we'll get onto the results later, but overall you kind of had a split between the drivers as to whether they thought it was good or bad. A lot of them seemed to like it after a while, and I think that transfers over to the fans as well. A lot of them seemed to like it, but there were some concerns. I particularly want to ask about this, the member of us here that has watched NASCAR a little bit longer than the rest of us, and was perhaps around, because one of the narratives, JD, is that this is a return to what NASCAR used to be, both at Bristol and just in general, tyre saving, looking after your shit and trying to make it last. As someone who watched that era, what do you think of this race?
It was great. I loved this race. Like you said, I actually went back and watched a little bit to refresh my memory of a Bristol race from 20 years ago, and you just reconfigure Bristol. It was just a single line around the bottom like we saw this week. Drivers didn't have to save their stuff as much at Bristol, but this was just an incredible return to form. Like, you had drivers doing, classic bump and run short track technique. Hit them once, hit them twice. Like, hey, I'm here. If they don't get out of your way, you shove them out of the way and you keep on going. That was good old short track racing. A little contact, but not just pile driving people. And then just putting the race back in drivers' hands. They controlled their destiny with how hard they pushed their car on their tires and how long those tires would last. We saw the drivers with more experience from that previous era of NASCAR, especially with the Gen 4 cars, of knowing how to save their stuff, or drivers who grew up short track racing. They had to conserve their stuff, not push 100% every lap, but to try to extend the life of the tires. And then you saw you had comers and goers throughout the runs. Some people just took off right at the start, burned up their tires, and then they fell back. Other drivers, they started slowly, maybe lost a couple positions, then roared to the front towards the end of runs. It was really great to see that element of strategy and just not just in the driving, but then also with the crews. Like, teams like, okay, we're going to try to stay out as long as possible. Driver, please do your best to, make pace while also saving your stuff. And you saw those who could and those who couldn't. And that was super refreshing. And the passing and the pace difference between old tires and new tires, you saw during the green flag pick. We had a green flag pick cycle in a next gen era. That was so freaking awesome. And you saw the pace difference between old tires and new tires. It was like watching a multi-class race at Bristol. Shout out to I5G for doing that on iRacing. But it looks legitimately like that. You had guys flying 2-3 seconds a lot faster at Bristol than guys on old tires. It was complete it was complete chaos, and they didn't crash. It was fantastic to see. Like, green flag pit stops, like, I'm excited to see that now. When 20 years ago, I'm just a kid, like, oh, it's another green flag pit cycle. I guess I'll see how it cycles out. Now it's like, yeah, I haven't seen this forever. It was super refreshing.
I've never seen you so excited.
I really enjoyed this. It brought me back to when I was a kid and NASCAR was freaking good. I do agree with a lot of the drivers' complaints that, okay, maybe this tire degrading to the cords was too much. I completely agree about that, especially from a safety perspective. But like, if they like bring it back a little bit, this is a perfect short track racing tire for the premier stock car short track racing series in the country that was built on short track racing and good short track racing. Bristol was back on the concrete, and Bristol was back. Why they had built that place to hold 160,000 people, because the racing was just that good every freaking time NASCAR went there. It was beautiful. I loved it.
I love that you loved it. Right? I like seeing you this excited. I do remember. I remember sitting there with the broadcast on yesterday. I was like doing the dishes, just doing my like early day chores around the house on Sunday, and then Mike Joy comes on, and he says, "Yeah, they just decided this morning to put the resin down on the lower line of the track," and I'm like, my ears perked up. Right? I'm like, "Oh, you changed the track this morning right before the race. What are you doing?" I thought it was going to be terrible. And then it ended up, not to say that was the only thing that made the race good, right? But yeah, a change like that to the track the day of the race.
Yeah.
And then sending them out there, not knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the thing is, like, we've spoken ad nauseum about this next gen car, how it has too much aerodynamic grip and then too much mechanical grip. And this was a case where they're not necessarily going fast enough for the aero grip to matter, and then the mechanical grip was compromised. You had to increase the off throttle time for these cars around this track, and that made the racing fan freaking tastic, where they're not pushing 100% every single lap. Because drivers pushing 100% every single lap, everyone's going the same freaking speed. It gets boring as heck and doesn't allow the different driving styles to really blossom and show the different types of skill, how these drivers are able to get these cars around the track, how people make speed, or how they use strategic driving to their advantage. This opened up that playbook again, which we've been talking about ad nauseum for the past year. And like, this really shows, like, these guys are freaking good. Put the races back in their hands. Let their crews make decisions and open up the strategy. Put it back in their hands to make these races exciting. I want to see a good fuel mileage race. I want to see a good short track race. I don't want to see, whoever starts up front in clean air just run away and then aero block the whole time. That gets boring real quick. Like, I want to see what we saw. We saw, veteran drivers run down the young bucks because the young bucks burned up their stuff and haven't learned patience yet. So drivers read traffic, go through traffic, and execute at the highest level. This was fantastic. I loved it. I really freaking loved this race. I know we can't have this every week, and again, this was an extreme example. Don't want to see court showing ever, but this was like the best problem that they could have ever had for a Bristol spring race. Like it was great, and I agree. Like, this can't be the same tire compound that we saw, because the only difference between like the fall and now is like the temperature by like 5-10 degrees air ambient temperature. The fall race tire, it put rubber into the track. This one was disintegrating into dust, not going into the track whatsoever, and leaving rubber confetti all over the place. I don't know what they did. Just bring it back maybe like 2 or 3 pegs, and you got the perfect short track tire.
This is the Into the Paddock Podcast.